Have you ever started something really, really challenging? You know, something that just felt like it took everything you had, all your skills, your energy,
Hmm.
your focus. Maybe like launching a big project or starting a company or even something physical like intense training.
Yeah, absolutely.
And did you find as you got deeper in that the real roadblocks weren't just the technical stuff, but something else, something more, well, personal?
Oh, definitely. Like how you handle the pressure,
Yeah.
right? Or how it spills over into the rest of your life.
Exactly. The unexpected ways it hits your life, your relationships, outside the actual task.
It's so often those less obvious things that really test you. We get laser focused on the strategy, the how-to, you know.
Right.
Sometimes we forget about the who, the actual person doing it, and everything around them.
Totally. And that's exactly what we're digging into today. We've got this collection of source material here, all centered around church planting. Now, when you think church planting, you probably jump to the strategic side, right? Like ministry models, launch teams, finding a place.
Evangelism campaigns, all that
Right.
stuff. Yeah, critical things, absolutely.
Sure. And there's definitely, like you said, a growing amount of resources, training focused on that methodology.
There is lots on the how.
Right. But the material we have for this deep dive, it keeps pulling back the curtain on something else, something maybe less talked about, but, well, profoundly important.
Which is,
The huge impact church planting has on the planter's personal life, their marriage, their family, it keeps coming up.
it really does. And it highlights some pretty sobering stats, high attrition rates, for example, in ministry and planting.
Yeah.
And it points out that a surprisingly big chunk of that attrition is actually seen as preventable.
Preventable. Wow, that word really jumps out, doesn't it?
It does.
So, okay, our mission for this deep dive then is to unpack these sources. We want to uncover those critical personal dimensions, the often hidden challenges.
And the support structures too, right?
Mm.
What's needed for planters not just to start, but to actually last, to thrive.
Exactly. Thrive. It's
Yeah.
a deep dive not just into the methods of planting, but into the personal and relational ground that planter needs to be standing on.
Okay, let's unpack it.
All right, let's dive in. So the material starts off with some pretty striking data. It mentions one study, over 500 mission agencies, found that nearly three-quarters, 75% of all missionary attrition was due to preventable causes.
Preventable. That's a massive number.
Yeah.
So many people stepping away when perhaps they didn't need to.
It seems huge. And then the sources break down why that preventable attrition happens. And this is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Yeah. What did they find?
Well, about a quarter of it was linked to various personal causes, just personal stuff.
Okay.
13% to marriage and family issues.
13%. Right.
And another 6 to 9% came from problems within the ministry team.
Wow. So if you add that up, what, over 40%? Over 40% of the preventable reasons people leave are tied directly to their own well-being, their family, or their team.
Yeah. That feels like a huge wake-up call if everyone's just focused on the strategy, doesn't it?
It absolutely is. And it really hammers home the material's main point.
Yeah.
Success isn't just about having, the perfect plan. One observation in there notes that a lot of the existing church planting books and training,
Yeah.
they failed to really address these crucial personal dimensions properly.
That really lines up with a quote they included from Jay Pinney, Coordinates Planting in Quebec.
Right. What did he say?
He points out that, resources on how to plant are growing, but there's still very little focus on the planters themselves, the actual people, and the unique stresses they and their families are under. He's really insistent that the planter's personal and spiritual life needs way more intentional focus.
Yeah. Which leads to this really powerful conclusion you see threaded through the sources. A church planter is just as likely to, struggle or fall short because of personal inadequacies,
Right.
or maybe not being able to handle team dynamics as they are because their strategy was flawed.
So the preparation has to go way beyond just learning ministry techniques.
Exactly. It's much broader.
Okay, that definitely reframes things.
Yeah.
So if the perfect method isn't the whole story, what does make a planter effective? What are those essential qualities beyond just the standard ministry toolkit?
Well, the sources dig into that. They reference research on church planter competencies.
Yeah.
People like Graham, Ridley, Thompson, Hertzberg.
Mm-hmm.
They tried to pin down the core factors.
And what came out of that research? Was it about personality or skills or?
They kind of landed on three broad essential categories. And importantly, they listed them in order of priority.
Okay.
Number one, spiritual life dimensions.
Spiritual life first. Okay.
Second, church planting skills and knowledge, your how-to. And third, personal and interpersonal abilities. So notice the personal and spiritual stuff comes before the technical skills.
Wow. Okay, that's a fundamental shift from how maybe a lot of people would think about it instinctively. Skills are important, yeah, but they're not job one.
Exactly. And if you look at the findings from different researchers like Ridley and Thompson are mentioned, you see a lot of overlap in the specific things they flagged as most important. Stuff like being intrinsically motivated deep down, having real spousal cooperation and family commitment,
Makes sense.
a strong personal faith, integrity, visioning capacity, leadership, knowing how to evangelize, using the gifts of others well, and crucially, flexibility and resilience.
Resilience. Yeah, that word seems to pop up again and again in this material.
It really does.
So if we pull all that research together, if we had to synthesize, like, the absolute most important qualities identified, regardless of the specific approach or context, what would that list look like?
Based on the sources, the core qualities boil down to these. A clear sense of God's call, godly character, strong personal spiritual dynamics,
Yeah.
Prayer, listening to God, really solid spousal support, a mission-specific skill set, that blend of spiritual gifts and practical abilities, high emotional intelligence and adaptability,
Okay.
and having spiritual gifts that actually fit the task at hand.
That list. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense when you think about how complex this role actually is. It's a deep mix of character, conviction, relationship, skills.
Right. And the sources add that for more specialized roles, apostolic planting, starting movements, or cross-cultural work, even more competencies become vital.
Like what?
Things like advanced personal maturity, really significant cross-cultural adaptability, strong evangelistic and entrepreneurial ability, specific cultural adaptation skills, flexibility again, resourcefulness, being a self-learner, and being able to adjust your leadership style, considering generational things or people group distinctives.
That just adds layer upon layer of complexity.
It does. But here's a really vital point the sources make, and it's encouraging, I think.
Yeah.
No single planter is realistically going to have all these abilities perfectly polished.
Okay, that's a relief.
Right. The strength needs to come from the team's combined competency set. The collective is what's key.
Okay, so it's not about finding some kind of ministry superhero, but building a group where the necessary gifts and qualities are present together. That shifts the perspective nicely. Okay, let's dig into that first category you mentioned, spiritual life dimensions. The sources call it the unseen engine.
Yes, and the language they use suggests it's not just important, it's absolutely fundamental. The material is pretty direct. No amount of study or strategy training or even past ministry experience can substitute for a genuine call from God, His active leading, and the empowering presence of the Holy Spirit in the lives of planters.
Tell me more about that idea of the call. It's a term we hear a lot, but what did the sources say about it specifically here?
Well, it describes the assurance that God has appointed you as providing tremendous confidence and crucial staying power, especially when things get tough, which they inevitably do.
Right.
And the sources are careful, though. They note this conviction doesn't have to be some dramatic supernatural event. It can be an obvious call, like Peter getting clear directions to go to Cornelius.
Okay.
Or it can be more of a subtle call, something that grows progressively through engaging with Scripture, praying, reflecting, talking with others, kind of like the decision-making you see in Acts 15.
Okay. So it can unfold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the critical thing is, it needs to be a genuine, settled conviction within the planter. Ideally, shared and owned by their spouse, and importantly, affirmed by their local church community.
So it's personal, but it needs that external validation too.
Precisely. And right alongside that is spiritual maturity. The sources argue planters should really be chosen from people who are already showing maturity, established spiritual disciplines, proven ministry skills where they are now. God uses formative experiences, sometimes they call them crucibles, or times of sacrificial service, as really powerful teachers to get them ready for the intensity of planting.
How does that kind of spiritual depth actually help when you're facing all the pressure, the setbacks, maybe even opposition?
Well, a deepening spiritual walk is framed as essential for just weathering those storms, for responding graciously when you're under pressure, for maintaining trust in God when everything feels unpredictable or even hostile.
Right.
The sources talk about wilderness experiences, often being part of this maturing, times of isolation, for instance. They're highlighted as often being used by God to teach really profound lessons you can't easily learn in the busyness of normal ministry.
Okay.
This might mean, wrestling deeply with God, which leads to greater intimacy, deeper dependence on him, more humility, patience, learning new ways to handle pain or disappointment. If someone hasn't learned through those kinds of trying times, the shock and stress of cross-cultural challenges or intense ministry pressure later might just be too much. There's a piece of advice quoted that really sticks. Don't come with ready-made agendas. Come to learn.
Come to learn.
Yeah. This whole process needs constant prayer, trust, humility, respect, and just relying on the Holy Spirit's filling.
That's such a powerful picture, that the preparation is as much about this inner transformation and reliance as it is about external training or having the right strategy.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the sources explicitly point to prayer and established spiritual disciplines as just non-negotiable.
Non-negotiable.
Yeah. These habits have to be well ingrained before you step into the intensity of planting. Because in many new or cross-cultural settings, planters often don't have that built-in support system of an established church.
Right.
So they have to cultivate their spiritual life more independently, often needing new or maybe deeper patterns because their old ones just weren't enough for the demands of what's sometimes called the church planting battlefront.
I noticed the material mentioned a study by Grady and Kendall that found prayer was the #1 factor identified for success.
Yes. That statistic jumps right out, doesn't it?
Yes,
It underscores this conviction presented throughout. A planter who hasn't really cultivated an effective prayer life and ministry, well, they probably won't get very far. The sources connect prayer directly to evangelism, referencing Ephesians 6, and describe focused intercession as being the very heart and soul of a church planting ministry.
Heart and soul.
Yeah. One mission even shared that it asked its teams to dedicate 10% of their ministry day just to prayer. Things like evangelistic prayer walks, prayer vigils, maybe corporate days of prayer with fasting.
Wow, 10%. That really elevates prayer from just a personal discipline to a core strategy of the ministry itself.
Absolutely. And speaking of the dynamics of ministry, the sources also spend quite a bit of time exploring the crucial role of spiritual gifts, particularly how they function within a team.
You mentioned earlier that the team's collective strength have key. How do spiritual gifts fit into that picture?
Well, the material points out that God uses a whole variety of gifts to establish and build his church. You can't really create a perfect formula, but certain gifts seem especially relevant during different phases of planting.
Okay, like what?
So, for instance, the initial launching phase might really lean heavily on evangelistic and apostolic gifts.
Right, getting things started.
Exactly. Then, establishing the new community often requires teaching and shepherding gifts to nurture people. Structuring the body benefits from leadership and administration, and then reproducing new communities kind of circles back to needing those evangelistic and apostolic abilities again.
So often leadership-type gifts.
Primarily, yeah. But the sources broaden this out by looking at biblical examples of how gifts functioned across different members of a team.
What kind of biblical teams and gift mixes did they highlight? I'm curious.
They use this really helpful idea of needing a constellation of gifts on a team. They describe 3 main functions you see in early church teams, and the gifts typically associated with them.
Okay, what's the first function?
First, the church foundation layers. Think people like Paul, Peter, Barnabas, Epaphras. Their gifts often included that apostolic capacity, especially for cross-cultural work, evangelism, powerful preaching, strong leadership, deep faith, and encouragement.
Right, the pioneers.
Exactly. Paul and Peter are obvious examples of powerful preachers. Barnabas is noted for his encouragement, his ability to build bridges, and Epaphras showed incredible faith through his persistent intercessory prayer.
Okay, so laying the groundwork. Who's next in this constellation?
Then you have the church waterers, or developers. These are folks like Apollos, Timothy, Titus. Their gifts are often centered around teaching, administration, ongoing encouragement, counseling, basically, the things needed to nurture and build up a community after it started.
The builders.
Yeah. Apollos is described as eloquent, a deep student of the Old Testament, someone who watered the church in Corinth after Paul planted it. Timothy and Titus were key in strengthening believers and organizing the churches where they served.
And the third function?
The church planting assistants. Priscilla and Aquila are a prime example here. They had gifts like helps, hospitality, mentoring, practical teaching, encouragement.
The essential support crew.
Totally. The sources really highlight their teamwork, their active involvement in evangelism, and their ability to help form and train others. They even mentored Apollos. It's noted Paul calls them fellow workers, and Priscilla is often listed first, which underlines her significant contribution.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And the sources also point to Paul's detailed greetings in Romans 16. It just showcases this incredible variety of assistance he had described with terms like servant, fellow workers, dear friend, outstanding, approved, hard workers, and even, touchingly, a mother.
Wow, that paints such a vivid picture. It's clearly not just about one type of leader or one superstar gift.
Exactly. And the material emphasizes that gifts from each of these categories, foundation layers, waterers, assistants, should ideally be present within a planting team, particularly for complex stuff like cross-cultural or urban projects.
Makes sense. You need that balance.
But they also include a really important caveat. God isn't limited by any formula or structure we come up with. He provides what's needed. He uses all kinds of workers, vocational people, lay folks, entrepreneurs, people who consolidate the work, strong, upfront leaders, humble helpers behind the scenes. They quote Henry Blackaby, encouraging the church to just release God's people as the Spirit directs, empowering them to do what happened in the New Testament, proclaim the good news, and trust God to gather new believers into new church communities.
That ties back so well to the spiritual foundation piece. It's God's work, His Spirit working through all sorts of different people and gifts. But the sources also use some pretty strong language, describing planting not just as work, but as a spiritual battle.
It does. The material definitely frames church planting less like, say, a business startup or a standard profession,
Right.
and more as a spiritual battle. It views planters as frontline troops, actively working to regain territory that's been influenced by darkness.
So it's not just about human effort overcoming human resistance or indifference.
No, definitely not presented that way.
Yeah.
Jesus gives that foundational assurance, right, that the gates of hell won't prevail against his church's advance.
That's 16.
Yeah. The core goal is seen as setting captives free through the gospel's power, facilitating their transfer from the kingdom of darkness into Christ's kingdom.
Okay.
And that requires planters to learn how to discern the spiritual forces at play, recognize Satan's strongholds, and rely entirely on God's power and the spiritual weapons described back in Ephesians 6. They also mention needing spirit-empowered apologetics to expose deception.
That sounds incredibly demanding, spiritually exhausting maybe.
It requires a willingness to truly count the cost, as Jesus said, and to engage in really fervent, persistent prayer, like Epaphras wrestling in prayer for the Colossians.
Right.
The stakes are seen as eternal. So those involved need to understand how to use their spiritual armor, walk daily in Christ, and draw strength for the fight directly from his power. The material suggests that those who've already faced and weathered spiritual battles and seen God win, they tend to become more alert, more skilled at recognizing and responding to Satan's strategies.
Is there a particular weakness or maybe a blind spot they identify, perhaps among Westerners engaging in this?
Yes, actually. A common weakness highlighted is what's termed a functional materialistic worldview among many Western believers.
Functional materialistic. Okay, what does that mean?
It means they might intellectually believe in Satan and spiritual forces, yeah. But in practice, day to day, they tend to operate as if rational persuasion, good teaching, and just building friendships are enough to bring people to Christ.
Oh, okay, so they're not really prepared for.
Exactly. It leaves them functional unprepared for direct spiritual attacks or for encountering people who are genuinely dealing with spiritual oppression.
What specific kinds of situations do the sources say planters should be prepared for that maybe go beyond typical pastoral counseling?
Well, they list things like needing to help new believers really grasp their identity in Christ and integrate that with genuine freedom and worldview change, discerning the true source of debilitating habits that might actually have spiritual roots,
Okay.
assessing spiritual influences and practices within the community, and having some kind of framework for helping seekers or new believers who might be experiencing forms of demonic oppression or even, in some cases, overt possession.
Wow. Those are incredibly serious issues.
They are, and the sources are very clear. Trying to learn about this stuff just by reading books isn't enough. It's not wise.
Right.
They strongly recommend seeking help from veteran planters, drawing on people in the team or wider network who have a gift of discernment, and involving experienced prayer teams or others with specific expertise when dealing with potential cases of oppression or possession. Don't go it alone.
That makes sense. So, okay, we've covered the spiritual foundation, the essential gifts needed on a team, the reality of the spiritual battle. What about the internal pressures? The emotional strain on the planter themselves?
Oh, it's immense. The sources quote Elmer Towns, who famously described church planting as getting a church started in the face of insurmountable obstacles with limited resources and unlikely circumstances.
Wow, just hearing that description is stressful. How do you prepare emotionally for something that sounds, well, humanly impossible?
Exactly.
Ugh.
What are some of the specific stressors they mention?
Leslie Andrews is referenced, listing stressors unique to missionaries and planters. Things like navigating cross-cultural living and communication, dealing with isolation, maybe political unrest, ongoing conflict, just heavy work obligations, and chronic limits on time and resources.
Constant pressure.
Yeah. The general categories of stress and burnout factors often mentioned include constantly dealing with multiple new things all at once, a persistent lack of resources and not enough help, losing your familiar support systems,
Right.
the inherent difficulties of just starting a brand new community from scratch and facing ongoing opposition or maybe just a lack of recognition for the huge effort involved. It sounds like just being constantly overwhelmed.
It's portrayed as a uniquely demanding role. The sources use this analogy. It's like starting a small business staffed entirely by volunteers
Okay.
in a market that isn't actually very interested in your product.
Ouch. Yeah.
Planters can often feel like intruders, misunderstood, maybe undervalued. And on top of that, significant role changes are just part of the job. A planter might have to be the vision caster, the strategist, the developer, the manager, the leader, the trainer, often all at once, regardless of their natural strengths or personality.
So what kind of internal qualities are just absolutely essential to manage that level of pressure? What do you need inside?
Church planting demands significant emotional intelligence, fortitude, and particularly resilience. That word again.
Resilience, yeah.
Emotional resilience is highlighted as a core qualification. It's the capacity to sustain yourself emotionally and physically through repeated setbacks, losses, disappointments, even outright failures. Resilient people are described as adaptable. They can accept change even without the usual external comforts or supports. They adjust to constantly shifting, challenging environments. They bounce back from difficulty, find strength within, and show perseverance even when things feel deeply discouraging.
Resilience makes complete sense. You'd absolutely need to be able to take hits and just keep going.
Absolutely. And closely tied to that is strong self-management.
Self-management. How so?
Well, unlike a typical pastor who might have a clear structure, maybe supervision from a church board,
Right.
planters often lack that external accountability or defined schedule. Many work from home, which blurs the lines between work and personal life. No regular hours, responsibilities might feel undefined. This can lead to struggles with using time and resources well, maybe chronic indecision or procrastination, or retreating into the perceived safety of home or the office instead of actively engaging out in the community.
It sounds like the ultimate test of being your own boss, but with this huge layer of ministry pressure added on top.
It really is. The sources are clear. Church planting requires focus, discipline, clear goals, self-control. They strongly suggest that planters should have already demonstrated an ability to manage their time, their families, their existing resources effectively before they start this.
Okay, like a prerequisite.
Yeah. Jesus setting his face resolutely toward Jerusalem is given as an example of that focused resolve. And while maybe some people have this instinctively, for most, it's a learned behavior. It requires realistic self-assessment, cultivating healthy habits, establishing clear boundaries to stay on track toward the vision.
Boundaries seem key.
And notably, the sources reiterate that among the most essential healthy habits, the discipline of prayer is the first one that needs prioritizing.
Prayer again. It really is presented as central to absolutely everything, isn't it?
It truly is.
Now, if the planter themselves is under that kind of internal strain, I can only imagine the pressure this puts on their marriage and family life. That must be intense.
The sources are very direct about this. They state that while, any Christian marriage faces stress, church planting introduces rare and uniquely intense stressors.
Rare and uniquely intense.
Okay. It challenges relationships in ways that are different from more traditional ministry roles, especially during those initial formative years.
What are some of the main stressors they identify that impact the home front?
Well, initial changes like a big relocation, especially crossing cultures, often trigger what's known as culture shock.
Ah, culture shock. Yeah.
It's described as this adjustment reaction syndrome. It's the cumulative stress of swapping a familiar culture for one that feels strange, unfamiliar, often with very little existing support. People going through it typically move through phases often called honeymoon, crisis, recovery, adjustment.
And this culture shock, it doesn't just hit the individual, right? It directly strains the marriage.
Exactly. These drastic changes, often hitting all at once, can put immense pressure on the marriage because husbands and wives frequently experience planting and cultural adjustment very differently. Well, the husband's ministry role might seem clearer, maybe more externally validated right away. The wife might struggle more with role-related stress if her role feels undefined or less immediately critical to the ministry's success. Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the wife adapts faster, learns the language quicker, builds local relationships more easily than her husband. When spouses have such different needs or perceptions, or they're just adapting at different speeds, maintaining marital harmony becomes a huge challenge.
The material includes a case study about a winter in Quebec that really brings this home.
It does. It's a powerful picture. The wife's experience, trapped by a terrible snowstorm, struggling with French road signs she can't read, getting stopped by police for a minor thing she can't understand.
Oh, wow.
Feeling completely helpless, breaking down in tears, desperately wanting to go home, missing her friends, her old job. Just profound isolation and helplessness. Yeah. And in contrast, her husband had a very different experience that day. His response, something like, "At least you're not in Africa," just tragically highlights that disconnect, that lack of understanding about her specific current stress points. It's a vivid example of how differently spouses can be affected by the exact same situation.
That's a heartbreaking illustration of the strain. And I can easily see how the blurring of lines between ministry and personal life, that lack of boundaries, would be a massive issue too.
Absolutely. The fishbowl effect is mentioned. That feeling that your daily life is constantly being watched, scrutinized by neighbors, community members, leading to a significant loss of privacy. This can be especially tough in collective cultures or tribal settings where the Western idea of personal privacy just isn't understood or valued in the same way. Protecting kids' exposure to this is also a major concern.
Right.
So there's this constant tension between the very real need for privacy and the equal importance of setting an example, maintaining your witness, practicing hospitality, maybe doing home-based ministry, all often essential parts of planting.
So the home often isn't just a refuge, it's also the workspace, the ministry hub.
Precisely. And this means family time can become incredibly scarce. Mentoring, evangelism, community building just expands to fill evenings, weekends. The sources stress that for healthy families, intentional time out, a dedicated family day off, these are non-negotiable necessities, but often really hard to maintain.
They also mention the emotional toll of constantly caring for people in crisis. That must add yet another layer of stress onto the family system.
Yes, definitely. The material highlights the high levels of stress and anxiety that are just inherent in people professions. And that certainly includes planters who are often caring for individuals, families facing deep crises, poverty, illness, relationship breakdowns. They frequently find themselves having to respond to emergencies with maybe little formal training, and this constant exposure takes a heavy toll on their own emotional health, physical health, and by extension, on the whole family. It's argued they need to manage their lives and schedules almost like health professionals who deal with constant high-stakes situations.
And what about financial pressures and boundaries? That sounds like another potential minefield, especially cross-culturally.
Definitely. The sources discuss that complex issue of economic disparity, the difference between the planter's lifestyle, even if modest by Western standards, and the local population they serve.
Right.
This often leads to frequent requests for financial help, food, medicine, school fees, job loss support. Figuring out where and how to draw lines while still being compassionate is this constant quandary.
So, given all these pressures, cultural, relational, financial, time, what are the key areas the sources say need really intentional boundary setting?
The material lists 4 critical areas for couples and families to nail down boundaries. First, space. How the home is used for ministry, what areas are private, off limits.
Okay.
Second, time. Balancing evening meetings versus family time, making sure there's a family Sabbath or day off.
Time. Got it.
Third, relationships. Protecting the spouse's own friendships, ensuring kids have Christian friends, deciding who the couple confides in for support, protecting children from inappropriate exposure to ministry difficulties.
Relationships.
And fourth, resources. How family finances are used for ministry or helping others, sharing personal belongings like cars or tools. Where do those lines get drawn?
Those are very concrete, practical areas couples need to tackle proactively, aren't they?
Yes. And the sources strongly encourage couples to seek God together on these things. Talk with experienced ministry couples. Maybe use discussion guides that cover these specific topics. Communication, boundaries, refreshing together, building support, sacrifice, teamwork, preparing for spiritual battle together, kids' education, nurture, friendships.
Mm.
It just reinforces that navigating these challenges takes real intentionality and mutual commitment from both partners.
It makes it so clear that the health of the planter's marriage and family isn't just some secondary personal issue. It's absolutely foundational to whether the ministry itself can be sustained and fruitful.
It really is presented that way, like the essential support structure holding the whole thing up.
Now, the sources also zoom in on some specific contexts within planting, highlighting unique challenges faced by women in planting roles, and also those who are bivocational planters. What did they uncover there?
Yeah, women are highlighted as a really significant, vital part of the planting force,
Yeah.
whether they're single or serving alongside a husband. But they can face unique challenges, especially in cultures with restricted cross-gender communication, like some Muslim or tribal societies. That impacts how they can minister.
Mm-hmm.
The sources point back to biblical examples, like Paul's fruitful partnership with women like Priscilla, Euodia, Syntyche, Lydia, Phoebe, Nympha, showing that creative, essential partnerships are possible today.
But despite that biblical precedent, there can still be specific difficulties women face.
Yes. One big challenge identified is role inequities. Women might be expected to contribute massively to the work, but not be given an equal voice in team decisions or strategy. There's an example given of a single woman, a medical professional, carrying a full ministry load but having no vote in team meetings, while male colleagues with less experience do. That kind of frustration and lack of recognition can be way worse in cultures that are more patriarchal or have rigid gender roles. It makes it really hard for women to find their place, feel valued, and those tensions can just fester if they're not dealt with.
And expectations can also be unrealistic for women.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Unrealistic expectations, especially for women juggling significant ministry responsibilities with raising children. The sources basically ask, if women are truly full partners in planting, shouldn't they get equal support and training, including practical stuff like childcare, factored into team schedules and budgets?
Good question.
Yeah. A study by Linda Wilson is cited, providing this detailed list of common challenges for wives in planting: navigating identity and role shifts, loneliness, figuring out evangelistic contacts, feeling ill-equipped for counseling demands, training leaders, coping with financial disparity, cross-cultural parenting struggles, setting boundaries, navigating organizational rules, and facing gender role expectations from both the culture and sometimes even the team.
That's a really comprehensive list of specific pressures.
Carol Downey offers a helpful perspective mentioned. Thinking about ministry broadly, service to God in all areas, family, church, world, can help women and men find better balance and maybe reduce some guilt over perceived shortcomings in one area. And the sources suggest organizations can really help by clarifying expectations for women's roles, intentionally providing opportunities for them to use their gifts, explicitly recognizing their contributions, and involving experienced women in preparing, training, and coaching new planters.
And what's the potential kingdom impact when women are fully accepted and empowered in these roles?
The material is quite clear. When women are fully accepted as co-workers, empowered to use their gifts, the impact is significantly multiplied. The missionary force itself expands. It becomes possible to reach women in cultures where men can't easily go. Local women get discipled and trained more effectively. Team decision-making is enhanced by their insights. The priesthood of all believers is powerfully demonstrated, and people are drawn to the community when they see women treated with dignity and equality in Christ.
Okay, so that covers some unique challenges and potential for women. What about bivocational church planters, often called tent makers, right? This seems to be a growing approach.
It is. Bivocational planting basically means using a secular job, business, or profession to either supplement or entirely finance the church planting work.
Okay.
The sources emphasize, though, this isn't a specific planting method itself. It's more a strategy for financial sustainability and getting integrated into the community. Critically, the planter has to be genuinely competent in both roles, the secular job and the ministry, and find ways to integrate them, manage the demands of both alongside family life.
Is this a new thing in missions?
Not at all. The sources point out the Apostle Paul famously worked part-time as a literal tent maker to support his ministry. The Moravian missionaries, who were incredibly impactful, were entirely bivocational, so it has deep historical roots.
Ah, okay.
But it's definitely having a resurgence today. It's common in creative access countries where traditional missionaries can't get visas, but also increasingly used in places like the U.S. for urban and rural planting. You hear terms like tent making, business as missions, marketplace ministry.
The material seems to make a pretty strong case for this approach, doesn't it?
It does. It lays out several compelling reasons. There's the theological basis in the priesthood of all believers. aligning with the New Testament where ministry wasn't just for professionals. There's historical precedent in the early churches spread through informal evangelists living and working among people. It provides an effective equipping context, arguing that living out faith alongside a secular job is often the best training, mastering skills through real-world practice. It offers increased relevance. Bivocational workers often identify more authentically with people, speak the local language literally and culturally, live more incarnationally, share common spaces.
Right, more natural connections.
Exactly. And finally, there's significant economic viability, especially where funds are tight. It mobilizes more self-funded or locally funded workers, freeing up traditional funds.
That sounds, yeah, like a really attractive model with lots of advantages. But what are the unique challenges they face? It can't be easy.
No. Stan Guthrie is quoted noting some early attempts at this magic bullet, sometimes misfired. Tent makers struggling with guilt over their dual identity or getting sent home burned out, broken because they lacked training or couldn't balance the demands. Stephen Rundle identified key issues: inadequate training, significant role ambivalence. He even described them sometimes as schizophrenic tent makers, caught between two worlds.
Schizophrenic tent makers. Wow, that phrase really captures the difficulty of juggling those two identities.
It really does. And the added pressure that business failure seriously hurts their ministry credibility.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It points to the challenge of serving too many masters, managing two major vocations, plus marriage, family. The need for spiritual discipline, Sabbath, boundaries becomes absolutely critical, but also way harder to achieve consistently. Time pressure is immense. Needs exceptional flexibility, resilience, time management skills. But interestingly, the sources tie success directly back to prioritizing those spiritual disciplines. You have to find time for prayer and God amidst the chaos. And the secular work itself serves a dual-purpose income, yes, but also access to common spaces, networks, organic evangelism opportunities.
What about attitudes towards bivocational work? Can that be a hurdle?
Yes, definitely. Attitudinal challenges. Their motivation can be really hurt if their ministry is treated as second class compared to full-time paid ministry, or if they lack support and recognition from sending churches or organizations. There's a quote from a Japanese planter who, while valuing tent makers, still kind of believed only full-time, salary-supported ministry showed enough faith in God's provision, subtly undermining the bivocational approach.
Ouch.
Yeah. And tent makers themselves can struggle internally with guilt, inadequacy, feeling like they're in liminality, chronically in transition, not fully belonging to either world. Plus, that achievement anxiety needing to succeed at both the business and the ministry. Business failure doesn't just mean financial loss. It damages their credibility and witness. Realistic expectations from everyone are crucial.
Okay, so given these really unique challenges, what are the recommendations from the sources for supporting bivocational planters better? How can we help them succeed?
They offer several key recommendations. First, improve selection and preparation. Tent making isn't for everyone. It needs specific traits: bravery, relational skills, multitasking ability, flexibility, hospitality, deep resilience, existing evangelistic and cross-cultural aptitude. They need entrepreneurial work skills plus ministry training and coaching to see their secular work as integrated ministry.
Okay, better selection and prep. What else?
Second, select the for-profit role carefully. The job or business has to be credible locally, amenable to relationships in ministry, a good personal fit, and crucially, allow enough time and energy for ministry demands.
Right. The job itself matters.
Third, work intentionally in teams with clear purpose and accountability. Teams provide incentive, allow shared responsibility. Multi-country teams were found particularly effective, interestingly. Frequent meetings, regular accountability, at least monthly, are seen as vital for focus and fruitfulness, plus a very clear common purpose and strategy for the whole team. Ramstad is quoted emphasizing the home church needs to understand their purpose, what they're doing in both roles, how they're operating.
Okay. Teamwork and clarity.
And finally, establish robust ongoing training and support systems. Recognition, moral support are vital. Working through reputable organizations helps with pre-field orientation, coaching, logistics. But ongoing training is needed after they arrive. Mentoring, coaching, distance aid. They benefit hugely from learning communities, like the Open Network mentioned, to share experiences with others in similar situations.
That gives such a more complete, nuanced picture. of what's needed to support bivocational planters effectively. It's way more than just helping them find a job.
It really is, and it loops us right back to where we started, doesn't it? Emphasizing that the planter's personal well-being, their family health, team dynamics, spiritual depth, these aren't just nice extras. They're absolutely foundational for long-term effectiveness and sustainability in church planting.
This deep dive has really powerfully illustrated that. Church planting is just this undertaking of immense demand. And based on these sources, the planter's internal world, their core relationships, their spiritual depth, they aren't secondary concerns at all. They're actually prerequisite for the work itself.
Absolutely. The material makes a really compelling case that neglecting the planter's personal well-being, their family's health, their spiritual vitality, well, that's a major factor in why people leave, and it can ultimately undermine even the most brilliant strategy or method.
And while our focus today has been specifically on church planting, based on this source material, so many of these insights. Gosh, the absolute necessity of resilience, the challenge and importance of setting clear boundaries between work and life, needing to balance demands on relationships, the critical role of prioritizing spiritual disciplines, the strength in working effectively in teams, the vital need to actively seek and build support systems. These aren't just relevant for church planters, are they? They resonate so strongly with any demanding pursuit, any big life change, or frankly, just the challenges of navigating a full life today.
Our hope, really, was that this deep dive would give you a more holistic, more human picture of the church planter, revealing that unseen engine, that personal landscape that is just so critical.
It's certainly done that for me. And to leave you with a thought to maybe chew on long after this deep dive finishes. The sources specifically highlight training workers who have what they call integrated identities, combining credible, often secular work with fruitful ministry as a key challenge for the 21st century global mission.
That integration piece.
Yeah. What might that truly integrated life of faith and work look like, not just for someone planting churches, but maybe for anyone seeking to live out their faith authentically in their daily context? What does that challenge mean for you?